Good afternoon, and welcome to the first statewide Digital Equity Planning Group meeting. A few housekeeping items before we begin. This meeting is being recorded. The California Department of Technology will be posting a video of this meeting, the slides, and transcript to the Broadband for All portal. Before we get started with the formal agenda, we would like to go over organizations that are here with us today. California Department of Technology. Chief Deputy Director Johnson.
Present.
California Public Utility Commission. Commissioner Houck.
I'll sit in for her until she comes.
Thank you, Director Rob Osborne. The Office of Emergency Services.
Yes, this is Monisha Avery,
Thank you,
Chief Equity
Monisha.
Officer.
Department of General Services.
Hi, this is Lizzie Williamson. Good afternoon.
Thank you. California Department of Education.
This is Jeff Bello for Mary Nicely.
California Department of Food and Agriculture.
President Rob Peterson.
California Emerging Technology Fund.
Present, Sunny McPeak.
California Transportation Agency.
Present, Lori Pepper.
California State Library.
Present, Josh Chisholm.
Governor's Office of Tribal Affairs. I believe cannot make it today, but thank you. Government Operations Agency.
Hello, everyone. This is Pam Chu, Chief Equity Officer with GovOps. Nice to be here with you all.
Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development.
President Canberra.
California Department of Aging.
President, this is Tanya Bautista.
Thank you. California Department of Correctional Rehabilitation.
President, Kristen Montgomery.
California Office.
Present, this is, Present, this is Cheryl Larson.
No, thank you, Cheryl. California Office of Data and Innovation.
Good afternoon, Haley Figroid.
Good afternoon, Present Adelina Sendejas.
Thank you. Department of Public Health. I believe Elena Costa.
That's me. So sorry. This is Elena Costa. Present. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Department of Rehabilitation.
Good afternoon, Jake Johnson.
Housing and Community Development.
Hi there, Sarah Poss here for HCD.
Hi, this is Mark Durham for ACD also.
California Department of Veteran Affairs.
Good afternoon. This is Isaiah, President. I'm the Deputy Secretary of Administrative Services and the Acting Agency Chief Information Officer.
California Department of Social Services.
Present, this is Selena Chow.
Labor and Workforce Development Agency.
This is Abby Snee, Deputy Secretary for the Future of Work at the California Labor Agency. Happy to be here.
Rural County Representatives of California.
Tracy Ryan here.
And I believe one final is Department of Corrections. Cheryl?
Yes, present.
Can we go to the next slide? There will be an opportunity towards the end of the presentation for the public to provide comments and questions. Until then, please use the Q&A feature and members of our team will record your questions for later. Today's agenda, we have a full agenda. and we will be hearing several important updates on the state's digital equity planning process. I'm now happy to introduce Jared Johnson, the Deputy State Information Officer and Chief Deputy Director of the Department of Technology, to provide a brief welcome.
Excuse me, Chief Deputy Director Johnson and Cole, there was a comment from one of the planning group members that if possible, if we could make sure to pen the our ASL interpreter that so she is more visible. That would be helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Adam.
Sorry, Jared, please unmute again.
Okay, Mr. Prisabillo, should I wait for the ASL interpreter to be pinned?
She is pinned and we should be able to go.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Jared Johnson, Deputy State Chief Information Officer and Chief Deputy Director of the California Department of Technology. Welcome to the first Statewide Planning Group meeting. We'll now get started with reviewing today's agenda. We will begin today's meeting with an overview of the Statewide Digital Equity Planning Group. Then we will hear an update from Scott Adams, Deputy Director of the California Department of Technology, on the State Digital Equity Plan. Next, we will hear from Gladys Palpaladak, the Federal Program Officer from the National Telecommunications Information Administration, also known as the NTIA. Gladys will provide guidance on the parameters of state digital equity planning required by the NTIA and upcoming state digital equity funding opportunities. The CDT team will then present an update on the state digital equity planning process, including outcome area working groups, the statewide asset mapping strategy using the Digital Equity Ecosystem Mapping Tool, the statewide digital equity survey, local events, and an upcoming stakeholder engagement opportunity. At the end of each presentation, we will pause and ask for comments and questions from planning group members. Planning group members, please use the Zoom function to raise your hand, and when called upon, please go off mute to ask your questions. Finally, as Cole previously shared, we will conclude today's meeting by addressing comments and questions raised in the Q&A. It is an opportunity for the larger group of partners, stakeholders, and members of the public to provide comment and ask questions and share their input. Next slide, please. The Statewide Planning Group, also known as the SPG, is an advisory group consisting of California Broadband Council member organizations and other statewide entities who will advise California Department of Technology on the State Digital Equity Plan work plan across the following 5 plan components: statewide public engagement, local and regional outreach, California Digital Equity Survey and Asset Inventory, outcome area working groups, statewide planning group. Next slide, please. Here are the statewide planning group member organizations. They include California Broadband Council members, as well as organizations from the 8 covered populations and outcome area experts. According to the NTIA's guidance, the statewide digital equity planning process should prioritize 8 covered populations and 6 outcome areas, which will be described in detail later in the presentation. The statewide digital equity planning group meetings are open public meetings and are publicly noticed in advance of each meeting. Here are the 2023 meeting dates and times, and we hope to see all of you at future meetings of the SPG. Now I am happy to introduce Scott Adams, Deputy Director of the Office of Broadband and Digital Literacy of the California Department of Technology. Mr. Adams.
Well, thank you very much, Chief Deputy Director Johnson, for kicking us off. And I want to say thank you to all of our Digital Equity Planning Group members for your participation leading up to this meeting and throughout the next year. I also want to welcome the other partner groups and individuals that are here today to participate in the planning process. And it's my pleasure to kind of walk through where the state digital equity planning process fits into Broadband for All. Next slide, please. So we really wanted to tee off this meeting with a quote from the California Broadband for All Action Plan, and that is that Californians' ability to access and use broadband is the difference between being able to fully engage in life and being cut off. And that's something that we knew that was present with the digital divide, but this was really amplified during the pandemic and reshaped both the states and the federal government's focus on closing the digital divide. Next slide, please. So Broadband for All is the state and Governor Gavin Newsom's overarching program to close the state's digital divide and foster digital equity throughout the state. And as called out in the Broadband Action Plan, access to broadband and infrastructure and service, affordability of service and devices, adoption of service and devices, and digital literacy and inclusion are critical components of digital equity. Next slide. This slide here is intended to show the evolution and multiple components that comprise Broadband for All. And you'll see at the top, it begins with the California Broadband Council, which since 2010 has been the central state agency convening entity that has worked on broadband deployment and adoption throughout the state in un- and unserved communities as determined by the California Public Utilities Commission. That work, as I said, was informed and directed by the governor's broadband executive order in 2020 in response to the pandemic, which directed the California Broadband Council to establish a statewide broadband action plan, which the Broadband Council did in 4 short months during the pandemic and outlined 24 specific action items that needed to be taken that could close the state's digital divide. What you'll see next is that in 2021, the historic Senate Bill 156 that was passed by the legislature and signed by Governor Newsom provided critical funding, over $6 billion, to develop the statewide middle mile broadband initiative, which a unit of the Department of Technology is leading with Golden State Net to develop a 10,000 mile statewide open access middle mile network to support last mile network solutions. And then an additional $2.75 billion was allocated to the Public Utilities Commission to develop complementary last mile infrastructure grant programs to support last mile connections out into the un- and unserved communities. In 2022, as a result of the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act created 6 programs that deploy $65 billion to state and local governments to further support broadband efforts. And the state of California and Broadband Council members are actively working to leverage investments in this program. What we would like to call out is that at the end of the legislative session last year, the legislature and the governor developed Assembly Bill 2750, which directed the California Department of Technology to seek federal funding to develop a statewide digital equity plan in consultation with the Public Utilities Commission, the California Broadband Council, and members of the public. And we have done that by receiving a planning grant from the National Telecommunications and Information Act to develop the state's digital equity plan. Next slide, please. Why we are here today, the Statewide Planning Group is formed to, as Chief Deputy Director Johnson said, inform the Department of Technology on both as partners and as advisors on the development of the statewide digital equity plan. We're really integrating with the Public Utilities Commission, who has been designated as the state's lead on the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. And so both the BEAD program is that program is known, and the Digital Equity Act programs consist of about over $45 billion that are eligible to states to support digital equity. Both of those come with statutory allocations that California is working to get our fair share of those funds to support broadband for all. Next slide. This slide just again represents the roles and responsibilities that the Department of Technology is the administering entity for the Digital Equity Planning Grant. The Public Utilities Commission is the administering entity for the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. Both of these planning processes are being coordinated, that over the next several months and year, extensive statewide and local engagement and input is being sought from a number of stakeholders and partners, and that when these two complementary plans are completed, it will unlock hundreds of millions of additional dollars to achieve broadband for all. Next slide. Something that we would really want to clarify here is that as far as what needs to be included in the state digital equity plan, the Digital Equity Act prioritizes or asks state to prioritize investments for 8 covered populations. And so it's really these populations through the lens that we will look as we develop the plan. And those covered populations are individuals living in covered households that are defined as at or below 150% of the federal poverty level, aging individuals age 60 and up, incarcerated individuals, veterans, individuals with disabilities, individuals with language barriers, that includes English learners and those with low levels of literacy, members of racial and ethnic minority groups, and individuals who reside in rural areas. Next slide. To provide context for the components of the planning process, CDT has developed the Statewide Planning Group, which is this body, to advise us on development of the plan. Additionally, we've developed 6 outcome area working groups that will connect to other policy priorities of the state. We will implement a number of digital equity surveys that you'll hear about later. We'll be conducting regional and local events and doing ongoing public engagement through meetings like this, through the Broadband for All portal, and other forms of communications. Next slide. This is a approximate timeline of the work that needs to go into developing the digital equity plan. And I think I draw your attention to the right to see that we have to have a final digital equity plan by sometime in November. And what's critical about that plan is that it will, once it's complete, it will have to be submitted to the NTIA and approved in order for the state to get their statutory allocation of digital equity capacity dollars. And so moving backward, there will be a public comment process on the draft plan. So the public comment process will be in August. The draft plan will need to be complete by July. There will be a data and gap analysis that will precede that. Between the months of February and April will be survey and ecosystem mapping And what has gone on in the months preceding this is stakeholder mapping, which are critical to identifying planning partners, but also entities that would participate in the implementation of the plan. If you look at the dates at the bottom, they symbolize where from the left to the right, where CDT applied for planning funds. The initial kickoff meeting that we had, our Broadband for All Summit on October 24th. We received our funding in December or late November. And then we've placed the 4 planning group meetings on this timeline. And what we are just really trying to stress is we know both the members of the planning group are very busy, so are our partners, but there is a lot of work that needs to be done to create the best digital equity plan for the state of California over the coming months. Next slide. And I will stop there for any questions.
Thank you, Scott. We'd like to open it up to the planning group members. If anyone has questions or comments for Scott, please raise your hand using the Zoom feature and be prepared to go off mute when I call your name. I'm not seeing any hands at this time, so thank you, Scott, and we'll proceed to the next presenter.
Thank you.
Our next presenter is Gladys Papalatok, Federal Program Officer and State Lead from NTIA, to present the next part of the agenda. Gladys, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jared.
Gladys, this is Cole Prisbell. Can I interject just for one quick moment, which is a helpful reminder on Zoom features and the assistance of our ASL interpreter, which is if you go to the top right of your view as a participant, make sure that you have the attendee view of side-by-side gallery on. That way you can see the 3 speakers or those that are pinned. Thank you. Gladys, back to you.
Thanks, Cole. An important reminder. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to CDT for inviting NTIA to participate today. We really appreciate it, and we've enjoyed working with the CDT team who are fantastic. My name is Gladys Papalatok, and I am one of 2 federal program officers or state leads for California. We're the only state in the country that have 2 FPOs. My focus today, as Scott introduced, is the State Digital Equity Planning Grant. Next slide, please. As you know, the DE grant is being administered by CDT, as Scott just talked about. This slide is an overview of the Digital Equity Act, the 3 programs that have been established, the eligible uses, and the overall timeline. CDT's timeline that Scott just highlighted is much more detailed, so this is just an overall timeline. And Scott probably already mentioned CDT was awarded the grant in December, and we are now in the first phase of the state planning over this next year, which will result in a state digital equity plan. NTIA, before the end of the year, will issue another NOFO, or Notice of Funding Opportunity, for the second phase, the State Capacity Program, and at that point, CDT will submit an application as well as the State Digital Equity Plan that will be developed. Upon approval, CDT will implement the State Digital Equity Plan over the next 5 years through about 2029. And in parallel, at about mid-2024 next year, NTIA anticipates launching the competitive program. Next slide, please. The following slides are more detail and components of the digital equity program. State allocations are determined by formula that can be found in the NOFO or the Notice of Funding Opportunity. And California, for the state planning grant, was awarded for $4 million. Next slide, please. This slide is more detail about the timeline under which states have to develop their plans in order to proceed to capacity grant stage. The left side of the slide there is where we are today. Next slide, please. As you may have already seen, these are the components in statute and from the NOFO of what is expected in the state digital equity plans. I won't read all of them, but they include barriers to digital equity, collaboration with key stakeholders, and a needs assessment. And really, this next year is about reaching out into communities far and wide and deep, more so than we've done in California. And California is at an advantage in that we've been doing this work, for over 10 years now, really. But this is an opportunity to reach deeper and wider into communities for engagement, input, and really go much deeper. Next slide, please. Asset inventory and outreach strategies and public comment, particularly with covered populations that Scott has already mentioned, are the really important pieces of this work in the next year. And we will be working closely with CDT team on doing the work with them. Next slide, please. Here are just examples, uses of the state planning grant funds to develop the state digital equity plan, to pursue digital inclusion activities, facilitate adoption of broadband, implementing training and workforce development programs, providing equipment and software for broadband services, construction and upgrades of public access computer centers. But again, these are just a few examples of the uses for the funds. Next slide, please. And as Scott stated, the state digital equity plans are really closely linked to requirements for the BEAD program as well. Digital equity is at the heart of both the digital equity and broadband and BEAD programs, and should be viewed holistically under a singular unified objective of closing the digital divide. We've got a little bit of an inside joke at NTIA that others may have already heard. BEAD without DE is bad. And so really CDT team and the CPUC teams are really working very closely on both the programs so that they are very much integrated with each other and implemented together. And next slide. That really is, that is the end of the presentation. Please let us know if you have any questions, and please, I am here to be a resource both to CDT and to the whole state, really. And so please reach out to us. And I think the CDT will be providing contact information. So we are at your beck and call for any questions, for clarification, and for also briefings to your own groups as needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Gladys. Planning group members, do you have any questions or comments? I'm not seeing any members with their hand up. So at this time, we are going to transition over back to Scott Adams and the CDT team to discuss California's current activities surrounding state digital equity planning. Sequentially, various components of the planning process will be shared by members of the Office of Broadband and Digital Literacy, otherwise known as OBDL, followed by the Broadband Equity Partnership, the California Emerging Technology Fund, and RSE. Scott, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Jared. My purpose here, I kind of set the tone at the very beginning, was to just, again, reestablish the digital equity planning process. So if you could go to the next slide, please. Again, wanted to point out that the statewide digital equity planning process includes 5 components. There's the Statewide Planning Group, which is this body, which is comprised of Broadband Council member entities and other statewide entities that have a connection to the 8 covered populations, or the subject matter expertise related to the outcome areas that we will focus on. The second is the outcome area working groups, which will you'll hear more about, but they'll do really a deep dive by outcome area working groups to identify any specific digital equity barriers for the 8 covered populations and identify how those barriers impact outcomes in those areas. And you'll hear more about that. One thing to stress, I see there was a question about how folks could be involved in the process. We want to stress that the first 2 items will be publicly noticed meetings available to all partners, stakeholders, and residents who would like to participate and weigh in. And we fully encourage participation in those efforts so that your voice can be heard. The third component is the digital equity surveys, which you'll hear more about. Those are designed to gather information from both organizations on existing resources, funding streams, et cetera, and then individual residents really oversampling the covered populations to assess barriers and needs. And we would actually like to issue a call to action now that we request participation from both the planning group members and others on this call to help promote and distribute those data acquisition tools that we're developing. The fourth part is the regional and local events. And I noted that while Zoom and technology have enabled us the ability to convene large numbers of people online, that there is a different type of engagement that occurs in person when we are local, and we can, in the communities that we are partnering with, to close the digital divide. And so you'll hear more about those later on, but we fully encourage folks to both participate in the broader planning group and outcome area working group meetings, and then to participate in the local events that are in your community where you live. And then the last component is the statewide public engagement. And one thing that I would mention to provide context to some of the folks you're going to hear from next is that with the Digital Equity Planning Group, we work to add our capacity to conduct the work that we need to do. And so the California Emerging Technology Fund, we have contracted with them to help design and implement the statewide digital equity survey, and also help lead in participation with us the development of the regional and local events. RSE, who you will hear from later, has been engaged to assist in the ongoing statewide public engagement. And then Broadband Equity Partnership is an overarching advisory consultant that is really helping program and project manage the effort. So that completes my portion. And I believe Chief Deputy Director Johnson, we could move on to the next item.
Thank you. Next up, we have Laura Sasaki, Cole Prisbilla, and Ann Wynn.
Good afternoon. I'm Laura Sasaki. I'm the Broadband Initiatives Manager in the Office of Broadband and Digital Literacy. My focus is, of all things, digital equity and inclusion. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing with the Outcome Area Working Group. So next slide, please. We have 6 outcome area working groups. These outcome areas are going to be taking a look at each of these specific areas through the lens of the 8 covered populations that Scott talked about earlier in the presentation. So we have an education outcome area working group that is co-led by myself as well as other co-chairs in the education ecosystem in California. We have a health outcome area working group that is co-led by Ann Wynn, who you'll hear from a little bit later. I'm also leading the digital literacy and inclusion outcome area working group. And then this one's a mouthful, but the essential services, accessibility, and civic engagement is going to be led by Cole Prisbilla, as well as the workforce and economic development. He's leading that work group as well. And then we also have our tribal collaboration work group that is co-led by Scott Adams, who's the tribal liaison for CDT, as well as Ann Wynn. Next slide, please. So each of these outcome area working groups are intended to bring together subject matter experts, as well as practitioners who are already working in areas around digital equity in California, but specifically to develop strategies that align with the goals and the statutory requirements of the state digital equity plan, as well as looking at all of this. Again, we always bring it back to our 8 covered populations. So for the outcome area working groups, we have 5 specific objectives, and they're going to be focused on working through developing a statewide stakeholder map specific to that outcome area work. So I'm going to say, for example, with education, we're going to be looking at digital equity practitioners and specialists throughout the state in that education ecosystem. The second thing that we'll be doing is conducting an asset inventory of programs, plans, and services throughout California. So compiling an extensive database of all of these resources to make available as part of the digital equity planning process. And then the third objective for the working group is to then take and leverage the stakeholder database that we've developed in the first step, and then promote and encourage the participation in the digital equity surveys. We'll hear a little bit more about those surveys later on, but just ensuring that we are able to, as Scott said, oversample populations, making sure that we make these surveys available to all Californians, and that we're able to really comprehensively acquire input into what those digital equity barriers in California are. So once we've done that, the outcome area working groups will then take a look at what the data that's been gathered, what are the digital equity barriers in California compared to where we are today and where we need to get to achieve digital equity in California. So the last step for the group is to take all of that, compile that information and data, and then develop recommendations to CDT to include in the final version of the digital equity plan. So I'm going to hand it off to Cole Prisbilla, and he'll talk a little bit more about the composition of those outcome area working groups.
Thank you, Laura. And I am going to pin myself, turn on my audio. I am Cole Prisbilla. I'm the Broadband Access and Deployment Advisor at the Office of Broadband Digital Literacy. And as Laura shared, we'll be running 2 of the outcome area working groups as leads. As you can see, these are our 6 outcome area working groups. And really what we wanted to insist with here is the breadth and depth of co-chairs that will be assisting and leading and being subject matter experts for these outcome area working groups. You can see there's a lot of opportunities for civic engagement and finding ways to plug in and share recommendations with this statewide planning groups and these outcome area working groups, and find alignment with the priorities that you find very important for digital equity. And so we look forward to you participating in these outcome area working groups. And we want to make sure that we express and share our appreciation for all of these co-chairs that are assisting with the outcome area working group efforts. With that, I'll pass it off to Ann Wynn.
Hey, Cole. I'm sorry. While this slide is still up, I also wanted to stress the column on the right, which is the key parties or partners or stakeholders and residents. We want to make sure to underscore that there is no exclusive membership in these outcome area working groups, and that all folks who would like to participate, these are encouraged to let us know and participate, and we will notice those. But we want the voices to be heard. So on the column on the right are suggestions of key parties that would want to participate in these groups, and those are not exclusive lists. Those are just suggestions and open to participation from, like I said, any partner or entity or individual who would like to participate.
Thank you for that clarification, Scott. Ann, to you.
Thank you so much, Scott and Cole, and apologize for the informality. I have to work around internet issues here. Next slide, please. Here we want to welcome as well as present to you 6 of our newly on board graduate student assistants. They were hired to help the Office of Broadband and Digital Literacy to expand our capacity in the work that we have laid out just now. 6 members are coming from the graduate school, the Goldman School of Public Policy here at UC Berkeley, and they are also on the call, so I'm glad that they're here with us. They will be supporting the Outcome Area Working Group to collect data, build out the stakeholder map, identify all the gap analysis, and eventually put together the report that we will incorporate into the final recommendations. So here are our 6 graduate student assistants, and thank you. Next slide, please.
So, Anne, before we move on, just a reminder to attendees, if you have questions for the Q&A, we are keeping track of those. We're compiling those to address at the end. So please continue to put those into the Q&A function in the chat so that we can get to those as we wrap up. Thank you.
I want to quickly add too that the GSAs are supporting the Outcome Area Working Group and the statewide planning groups.
Thank you all. Next up, we have Rich Navas and Yume Kitase with an update. They're from the Broadband Equity Partnership.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Rich Navas, and I work as a principal at Broadband Equity Partnership. We are program advisory consultants to CDT, assisting with overall program and project management for the state digital equity planning process. You heard Deputy Director Adams explain that the state digital equity planning process involves 5 components, and data gathering via surveys is one of those components. Next slide. The first segment of data gathering involves stakeholder mapping. We need to identify key stakeholders who should be at the table, contributing their input and participating in the planning process. CDT has been actively engaged in mapping stakeholders over the last year and continues to encourage participation through our outreach efforts to ensure a very inclusive approach to the digital equity planning process. Next slide. The next segment of data gathering involves asset mapping via what we are calling the Digital Equity Ecosystem Mapping Tool, or DEAM tool. Next slide. The DEAM tool will identify what programs and services are currently being offered, where they're being offered, and to whom they are being offered. In collecting this information, we will be able to see what's working and what's missing, so we can identify barriers to digital equity in each region. We are very grateful to all of you, including the co-chairs of the Outcome Area Working Groups, who collaborated with us to provide feedback as we have been developing and refining the DEAM tool. We plan to launch the Dean tool in February. Next slide. Who should complete the Dean tool? Any and all organizations, coalitions, practitioners, funders, and researchers with existing and planned programs and services throughout the state of California. Next slide. And how will you know if you're offering digital equity programs and services? If you assist the public with access to affordable broadband service, affordable devices, digital skills training programs, or any technology to help with services like employment, telemedicine, distance learning for education, we want to know about it. So please help us get the word out and please participate in completing the Dean tool. We look forward to hearing from you. I will now turn this over to my colleague, Yume Katase, to tell you about the Digital Equity Survey. Thank you.
Hey, Richna, before Yume goes, this is Scott. I wanted to add on this one that, as we said at the top, is any organization that provides services online, that, you know, whether it's education, banking, et cetera. We know in this technology dependent world, there's not much that folks can do without an internet connection and a computer. So the other thing we want, both for the statewide entities and the local and regional partners, if you provide services, we'd like to partner with you as well, because we want to make sure that for the 8 covered populations, that we create a bridge to the services you provide online by by providing assistance in getting home internet service and devices, et cetera. So I think that's just one minor addition I wanted to add there.
Thank you.
Yep.
Great. So now we're going to talk about the Digital Equity Survey. Next slide, please. We're administering a survey that's going to directly gather data related to barriers to internet access that Californians face. And the survey is going to include demographic information that will allow us to analyze our findings based on covered populations that were mentioned before, and hopefully even more granularly than that. And we're administering the surveys in 2 formats, online and via phone. So I'm going to talk quickly about the first one, the online format, and then I'll turn it over to Sunny McPeak at CETF to talk about the phone survey. The 2 surveys are aligned in content and language by design, so that we'll be able to compare the data that we're gathering from the 2. But the online survey is designed to be a shorter subset of the phone survey. And that's partly because the goal of the online survey is to distribute it as broadly as possible to the covered populations and to as many people as possible. And we're going to try to do that with the help of partner organizations and agencies, hopefully including all of you. So thank you in advance. And it's meant to be really a complement to the phone survey. And the idea is that by collecting a very large volume of responses, we're going to be able to capture some of those populations that are harder to reach when you just do random sampling. So we think with the 2 together, we'll have a very good picture more broadly of Californians and the barriers to internet access that they may have. So I'm going to now hand it over to Sunny to talk more about the phone survey.
Thank you, Yubi, and welcome everybody. Congratulations to the Department of Technology and all the state agencies, California Public Utilities Commission, when we have more than 200 people joining us. Thank you all for being here. The phone survey is going to be a random sample, a scientific sampling. And at this time, the Department of Technology in the state is actually going to do probably the largest random sample phone survey that's ever been conducted in California, way beyond what is normally done. Some of you are aware that historically, since 2008, we have been involved in a statewide survey. We're joining forces, and the Digital Equity statewide phone survey will get launched as soon as we have final sign off from the federal government. Our partner is the University of Southern California Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. They also were involved as the research team in the 2021 statewide survey. It's really exciting to have both the phone survey and the online survey complement one another, because we can get much more extensive input from targeted stakeholders and also the covered populations, as you just heard Yumi say. I will also comment that our goal is, when we say oversampling, to make sure we can get larger numbers of participants to fill out, if you will, the data to get to higher levels of reliability in terms of the sampling. And it will give us a lot of data around the covered populations. And because we are continuing with some questions that we've asked over a decade, we'll also have very reliable trends. All of this will be input to the planning process, the work groups, and the engagement events in the communities. I think I'm going to, at this point, I'm actually supposed to turn this now back. Well, maybe go to the next slide, but let me say 32 and talk about local events. 3,200, it's going to be a 3,200 sample survey, which is a very large survey, as I said before. So thank you. The local events, regional local engagement events, are also intended to get as much input as possible to this whole process. As I mentioned, you've got 200 plus people here. I know that many of our partners are participating. Thank you all for being here, because you're all a part of this process. And I take to heart what Secretary Tong has told all of us. There shouldn't be anybody left in California who wants to be involved, who hasn't been involved, that we haven't reached out to, that we haven't asked. That is our goal, and to just optimize this opportunity to learn as much as we possibly can. The regions that you see on the right-hand side actually are census regions. Several different organizations and agencies have slightly different configurations around regions. For example, there are regions for councils of government. There are regions for the Regional Broadband Consortia. There are regions that are looked at for the SURF program or used for workforce training. What we are going to do is, in 20 different convenings throughout California, bring together all of those stakeholders to cooperate with the state agencies. The state is leading all of these convenings, but in partnership with local stakeholders. We will want to include, as you see here, all of these attendees. From the 20 that we are going to conduct, 3 will be really focused on the engagement of tribal leaders, so that we can listen to the particular issues, concerns, and plans from all of the tribes in California. I want to underscore that tribal leaders are also going to be key voices in the 17 additional regional local engagement events. We are looking at, in terms of where they'll be held, a combination of where there's economic and geographic regions. They're usually often similar, but not the same. Where we have concentrations of populations that we need to listen to, including all 8 covered populations, which includes rural California. Everybody who lives in this grand state realizes how distinct our regions are. And then we're also identifying key local partner organizations and where they cluster together. This will be very iterative in the sense of consulting all of you as to the exact configuration of partners and also the precise locations. We will have to take into account some very practical considerations, such as, where do we have venues that the most people can get to? Are they available? Do they have the ability to support the kind of convening that we're doing with electronics, as an example? But all of you should be prepared to, in the next 3 months in particular, we're going to be organizing in February and March, April, May. If we have to, we may go into June. We really want to get all of these meetings convened in a period of time that gives us the rich input back to the statewide planning group and all of the work groups, so that the plan can be developed and then will be sent back out to all of you who have participated. With that, I think the next slide I'm actually handing off to a partner. And I just want to be able to acknowledge that among the organizations that are working as support to the California Department of Technology is a firm that goes by RSE. Actually, that's Runyon, Saltzman, Einhorn, a storied communications firm that was founded by pioneers Gene Runyon, Estelle Saltzman, and Jane Einhorn. So I get to introduce a colleague I worked with before in a different capacity. Susan Bringus, you're now on.
Thank you, Sunny. Hello. So yes, my name is Susan Bringus, and I am Vice President of Client Services at Runyon Saltzman, and we support the California Department of Technology with stakeholder outreach and engagement. RC has been working with CDT since 2021 to raise awareness around the digital divide and educate Californians about the state's proposed 10,000-mile-long network of broadband infrastructure. Just this past October, we worked with CDT and the California Government Operations Agency to hold a press conference for the groundbreaking of the Middle Mile Broadband Network in San Diego, and we're excited to partner with them again. So thank you again for your participation. Next slide. So for this effort, RSC will help CDT lead all stakeholder engagement as it relates to the state's digital equity planning process. Over the next few months, we will focus on helping CDT communications plan to engage community groups, local and tribal agencies, and residents across the state. The point of the plan it'll have a few different focus areas. The first being the development of an awareness campaign to inform and engage, like I mentioned, community organizations, as well as private sector stakeholders, local and tribal agencies, and again, Californians across the state, all with the objective of better informing residents in our state about why achieving digital equity is so critical and what we can all do to achieve real change in our communities. So as part of this campaign, we will encourage audiences to share their feedback for the digital equity plan through the outreach events that you just heard Sunny speak about, and through the online version of the digital equity survey, which you've been hearing about. But to encourage participation, the campaign will include culturally and linguistically appropriate assets, social media assets, collateral materials, all designed to simplify much of the information that you've heard here today so that agencies and organizations, community partners can all access these materials and promote the messaging themselves. We will also want to, of course, work in partnership with stakeholders to create community-centered assets and materials that will help these populations access the survey that we've been speaking of, and then come to events feeling informed and hopefully ready to participate. Secondly, we will also focus on making all communications accessible to the covered populations we've been speaking of and various community members across the state. This will include translating communications into many of our state's most common languages, as well as, of course, providing ASL interpreters at the events that you've heard about. Ensuring that the language used in our communications is always simple and relatable. And then lastly, it would also include ensuring that we're reaching the populations with our messaging in communities where they live, work, and play. So not just in one place, but at various touch points throughout their day. And this could be through partnerships with local ethnic media outlets, and of course, partnerships with local community and faith-based organizations. Next slide. And I think this is where I will turn it over to the moderator for Q&A.
Thank you, Susan. Also wanted to mention to those in attendance that a link has been provided in the chat to our participation form. So if you want to connect with one of our OAWGS groups, you can use that form to contact them. So at this point, I'm going to pause and thank everybody for the comprehensive update and ask if any members of the Statewide Planning Group want to ask questions about our digital equity plan and the various planning components. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands at this time. Mr. Adams.
Sorry, I was muted. I wanted to provide just a additional clarification and persistent call to action for both the planning group members and the members of the public and other partners that are here, that in each of the 5 components, we are requesting your partnership and participation, whether it's, feedback here at the planning group meetings, participation in the outcome area working groups, distribution of the digital, completing and then distributing the digital equity ecosystem mapping tool through your networks, and then really both at a statewide and kind of granular local level, promoting the online digital equity survey. Those are big calls to action. And then lastly, participation, attendance, and just helping us learn from you all at those local events is absolutely critical. So just wanted to reiterate that.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. Any other members have comments or questions? Okay, I'm seeing none, so thank you. The following portion of our agenda is an opportunity for the larger groups of partners, stakeholders, and members of the public to provide comments and ask questions and share their input. I will now turn it over to Laura Sasaki with CDT to proceed with our open comment and question section.
Thank you so much. We are now opening up to the public Q&A. And so what we're going to do first is we'll go through the questions that were submitted in the Q&A as we went through the presentation. So we'll get through those, and I'll let you know when we've concluded that. And if you want to actually talk to the planning group members or ask questions of the presenters, please use the raise hand function, and it will queue you up. And so once we get through the questions that were submitted, then I will start calling on people. So Scott, I'm going to start with you. This is in the Broadband for All questions, and I have a question of how can the small business community get better involved in this process? So small or commercial or micro businesses who may not have a physical location, but have critical needs for broadband, but they're not residential. What can be done to address this, specifically in older, historic, or rural areas?
Yeah, Laura, I think, I would iterate that we welcome small businesses and acknowledge that they're a critical, partner in this effort. And, Broadband for All in general, the goals of the middle and the last mile programs are to connect and underserved and community anchor institutions, throughout the state of California. Additionally, the goals of the California Broadband Action Plan are that all residents in California have access to internet service at homes, schools, libraries, and businesses. And so encourage small businesses to participate in the process at both the Middle Mile Advisory Committee level and at the Broadband Council level. Would extend an invitation to them to reach out to the broadband office if they have specific needs. And then lastly, I think, small businesses are a critical stakeholder in this. So participation in these meetings and the outcome area working group meetings and the regional local events are absolutely critical. So I think there's many touch points, and I would suggest that if that's overwhelming, the whole buffet of guidance that we just gave to reach out to our team, and we can plug them into the right work streams.
Thank you, Scott. I have now a question for the public survey. And so as appropriate, either Sunny or someone from BEP, if you could please respond to these. So Specifically, how can you please describe the steps that are planned to ensure the survey methodology and other outreach activities will be accessible to people with different types of disabilities?
I will comment first on the survey that is done by phone. So we do have, it is a phone survey that is a random digit dialing methodology, which is as extensive as we can really get in terms of a scientific sampling, with an obligation that, in fact, not only are we asking about someone who classifies themselves as having a disability, but also then making sure that the number of surveys that are collected match the population, match the demographic figures that we have. In terms of someone that we reach that has a hearing impairment, we can actually go back and specifically follow up on that individual. So that is the way in which we handle both making sure the sample is representative, but then that we also are as accessible as possible. I might add, it's also done in multiple languages, and that several calls are done back to this random sample in order to get a response. So that's the first way. I think Yumi will want to comment on how we're going to really extensively work with all of the networks that can reach those residents who are serving the population with disabilities. We at CTF particularly work with the World Institute on Disability, the California Foundation of Independent Living Centers, C4AT, and that umbrella really does have a pretty large reach. And then the CPUC has their program with telephony services that they can reach yet another large population besides the Department of Disability for the state. So I think we really want to focus in, but really appreciate the question. And for everybody who is asking a question about, are we thinking about it? Please tell us how to think better, number one. And number two, please help us reach the people that you want to have a voice in this. We're in this together. So I was trying to respond at one point just about small businesses. So everybody who's showing up, you're on the team. And we're going to ask you to help. So Yumi, you're now, I'm going to pass it to you.
Actually, Sunny, I'm going to step in and answer for Yumi, but thank you. I just wanted to add to what Sunny just said, that we are working very closely with the Department of Rehabilitation to incorporate all accessibility features in any online tools that we are developing. So we've incorporated screen readers, we're incorporating all the accessibility features that the Department of Rehabilitation recommends for people with disabilities, and we will also test our surveys with the Department of Rehabilitation beforehand to make sure that we've met all necessary guidelines. We are also incorporating audio features in these surveys, including the DEEM tool, in multiple languages to assist the public with limited English proficiency communities that also may have disabilities. So we are doing everything we can to be as comprehensive as possible in making these assessment tools as accessible as possible.
Thank you, Sunny, and thank you, Richna. A follow-on question to that is, how will the public surveys and other outreach with the working groups fit into the CPUC priority maps and the FCC availability maps? So I think that might be, let's see. Rob, do we have you here?
Laura, I'm here.
There you are.
So could you repeat the question?
Certainly. How will the public surveys and other outreach with the working groups fit into the CPUC priority maps and FCC availability maps?
So the quick answer is the priority area maps are being rolled out before the BEAD program will be rolled out. So we really need your feedback on the priority area maps through the feedback tool that's in that priority area map tool that's available right now. The surveys will be informing the digital equity plan as well as the BEAD plan, the 5-year action plan. So there's a timing difference. So I would look to, if you want to provide feedback on the priority areas, you should do that now, independent of the survey.
Thank you, Rob. Next question. Given that there is a focus on racial and ethnic minorities, will the survey and outreach be conducted in the most non-English languages spoken in California, at least 7 to 11 languages?
I will be happy to respond to that. We are covering 12 of the most spoken languages in California, and we're using the Census 2020 guidance on those 12 languages. So we will translate the online digital equity survey in those 12 languages, and we will actually also provide audio for those surveys in those languages.
Thank you, Richna. Back to broadband for all, we've got some more questions coming in. So Scott, or members of our team, but I think Scott, can you please give more specific examples of the types of programs that ultimately may be included in the SDEP and funded when the plan is implemented?
Yeah, so I think here's the way we're looking at it. I mean, first and foremost, I want to stress that we don't want to put our finger on the scale here before the process is actually taken place. So, you know, part of the whole deliberative planning process is to get a sense of what the ecosystem needs, and not necessarily to enforce, you know, our opinions on that. That being said, you know, the application that we submitted to the NTIA, you know, fairly well outlined that the state's existing broadband for all effort includes significant investments in infrastructure, both on the middle mile and the last mile programs, and that PUC particularly has existing suite of programs, you know, through the California Advanced Services Fund, et cetera, that covers above and beyond infrastructure. So broadband adoption, the public housing account, et cetera. The way that I think might help folks take a look at the process here. What are the things we called out in the action plan? Or what are the things that are needed that weren't called out that we need to fund? And so a good guidepost, I think, are along 5 different areas. Coordinated broadband adoption efforts and promotion of the Affordable Connectivity Program. So how can we, you know, could we potentially leverage capacity funding to empower both statewide coordination and really granular local and regional coordination? I think a second component could be on the digital navigation front, which is fairly all-encompassing. Assembly Bill 2750, our legislature has an interest in surveying digital navigation programs and considering again, a coordinated and unified approach to digital navigation throughout the state. A third piece could be on the digital literacy training side, is that how can this collection of state entities and then the broad ecosystem of partners identify, is there a need or a possibility to do, you know, coordinated, you know, statewide digital literacy training curricula that could address the various dimensionality of needs within the 8 covered populations that could potentially be both online once folks are online, but place-based for those who are not. The fourth, I would say, is knowing that devices are an important component of the adoption equation. What are specific needs within the covered populations, or specific, you know, subsets of those populations that we might craft or expand device programs to empower their outcomes. And then lastly, given that both the digital equity and BEAD side focus on workforce development, how can we you know, take stock of all of the existing workforce development programs? And so above and beyond digital literacy, how can we create training programs that support the 8 covered populations to not just be, you know, to digital literacy and digital inclusion, but to fully enjoy the social and economic benefits of this online ecosystem that these investments are looking to expand. So I think that, don't want, again, to put the finger on the scale or to, stop this, but, or not stop this, but to stop the process, is that really this process is about engaging the ecosystem and identifying where those opportunities are.
Thank you, Scott, for that answer. Really appreciate it. We have a question. What informational tools do you have available to share with the public and other partner organizations that may wish to join this effort, and where do we find such materials? So I can respond to that in part, and if anybody wants to add to that, please feel free. The majority of the information for our process right now is on our Broadband for All website. We have a specific digital equity plan area of that site that will be continued to be built out with more information as it becomes available. Sorry, I've got the sun coming in right now, so I look a little funny. But we'll get that put into the chat for you so that you have a link to that. I would just say continue to check back there. To be most plugged into the process is attending those outcome area working groups. Those will really have a heavy focus on the work that's being done to develop the plan. As events become available in your local and regional areas, attending those, participating in those, that would also add to just the amount of materials and information that are available. So continue to check in. We'll be having these meetings quarterly. We'll be having the outcome area working groups in between these meetings. So those are going to be your best sources for information and materials on the process.
Yeah, and Laura, if I could just add, thank you for directing folks to both the Broadband for All portal and the digital equity component. I think broadly on the Broadband for All portal, I want to stress that was a direction of the statewide broadband action plan that directed CDT to create a central repository of information and tools to support the ecosystem in closing the digital divide. And we really encourage folks, if you haven't gone through, to take a look, because there are informational sections on the various initiatives, the Middle Mile Initiative, the CPUC, Last Mile programs, et cetera. There's even a tracker where we track the progress on the action plan and in the executive order. And some interesting tools like where you can find state and local funding to support local efforts. There's information on the Affordable Connectivity Program and a tracker that really, thanks to CETF and CSU Chico, provided that to direct both the statewide efforts on ACP enrollment and to be able to track at a granular level how local efforts are driving enrollment. So just the call to action there would be to please be familiar with the Broadband for All portal. And we'd like your feedback on how we can grow and expand that to support, to leverage our resources to support the needs of the ecosystem and to let us know what's missing and how we can grow that. I think Laura touched on this. We have created an initial landing page and some pages on digital equity, but we plan on expanding those. And so your input, we're in the process of doing that now. Your input would really be welcome.
Thank you, Scott. Question on the survey. I hope the survey is brief, but how many questions? That's a great question. Thank you. Sunny?
The phone survey is intended to be completed in 13 to 15 minutes. You can go much longer than that. Certainly 17 is the maximum. And so it does go by actually fairly fast, and it is structured such that you don't have to answer all the questions, but it gets at all the information that is needed. So that's one good thing, that we absolutely do not want to have people just get tired and hang up. So that's how long that phone survey is, but that's why also you'll hear from HRNA and advisors and broadband equity partners what they're doing in terms of the online survey in order to get completion rates too. So let me just turn back to either Richna or Yumi on that one.
So the online survey, because it's online, we know we have, we need to make sure that our completion rate, we need to do a little bit more to ensure a good completion rate, I think. So we're intentionally doing it as a subset of the phone survey. It's at the moment it's 35 questions. And so it intended to be completed in a shorter period of time, but asking the same questions.
And I would just add, with the DEEM tool, we've been testing it out, and on average, it takes about 12 to 15 minutes to complete, depending on the kind of information you have to share. We are asking for a comprehensive approach, a comprehensive amount of information to be shared with us on your programs and services. So depending on the number of programs and services you have to offer, it really depends on how long that might impact your ability to finish the DEEM tool.
Thank you both. Moving on to a couple questions on local events. One of the questions is, once the events are decided, how can we keep track of where and when they will occur? We keep referring to the Broadband for All portal, and I'm putting another link in there. It's the same link that you found this meeting on. Once we have those dates and locations locked in, those will be posted up on the portal and made available to anyone and everyone who wants to attend. We encourage spreading the word once you do know about that, because we do want as much local and regional participation as possible. And it's just a really unique opportunity to have discussions and listening sessions with folks around the state. So that is one of the questions. And then Sunny, I think I'm going to direct this one at you. Is there an available list of CBOs signing people up for ACP? And actually, I'm gonna stop there. So yeah, I will actually address part of that. So that will be part of the asset inventory and stakeholder gathering process that the Digital Literacy and Inclusion Outcome Area Working Group will be doing as part of our work. So we may have a partial list from the pilot program that we've done. However, we expect to see that there will be a significant expansion of that list as we go through the process of working through both the stakeholder mapping and the inventory of programs that are out there. So Sunny, anything you wanted to add to that one?
Well, that was a perfect answer. Thank you, Laura. I will add that as you said, we're trying to recruit others. We'll train others. There is a toolkit that is available for any organization, and actually any organization can learn how to add on to do ACP enrollment. It is actually more effective if an organization already may be doing services to those who are in the education world, or maybe to older Californians, or in healthcare, that if you're adding on this opportunity to have affordable broadband in the context of a service that's already needed, it's going to be really welcomed by everybody. And earlier today, at our California Broadband Council meeting with Commissioner Darcy Houck from the California Public Utilities Commission, we talked about being able to support and provide training to all of those grantees that have received adoption accounts or adoption grants, excuse me. But yes, and you can contact CETF and we'll work with you, and we'll put you in contact with a CBO who's already trained. And then, as I just said, we'll actually provide training to build capacity.
Thank you, Sunny. And just a little bit of additional information on ACP. We've had, amongst others, the CDT, the California Public Utilities Commission, and CETF have all submitted coordinated grant applications for the ACP outreach grants. So a lot of what we are looking at for ACP will be, if we receive those grants, will be around the strategic planning of what we do with that grant funding in conjunction with the outcomes that we develop as part of the digital equity plan. So everything, as you're seeing, everything is interconnected, everything is linked. So that's just an additional piece of information, something that was done separately from this, but will also be, I think we talk about braiding funding or something like that with all of the various funding sources for digital literacy, digital equity, and access and adoption. So thank you, Sunny. Okay, so moving on to the digital equity ecosystem mapping. Well, the digital, this actually may be, we may have some overlap on survey questions, so bear with me as we work through that. Will the digital equity survey be accessible to stakeholders to reduce the need to duplicate efforts in surveying? And I'm not actually sure what that question means.
Laura, I'm wondering if the person who asked that question would feel comfortable, you know, coming on and kind of talking that through with us, because I saw that and I think it's an interesting question.
Eric Sasaki can now unmute.
No relation that I know of.
Nor I. Good afternoon.
Hi, Eric.
Eric Sasaki from the County of Los Angeles. I guess the question was, you know, we will, you know, as we definitely want to promote this survey and get it as far and wide as possible, you know, there are various organizations here locally that are trying to understand the same set of data, get as many of those surveys out as possible. So I was just wondering, as part of this process, whether, you know, stakeholders across the state will have access to the data, especially locally relevant data, to help inform our local programs.
Yeah, Sunny, I know your hand's up. I would want to just jump in from the broad perspective that Eric, and thank you for the question, is that all of the data gathering efforts are part of helping CDT in the state to fill the statutory requirements. And just the practical needs for us to make informed decisions about the plan and how we divert the digital equity capacity dollars. So, you know, absolutely the results of, I think I'm combining an answer here, the results of the digital ecosystem mapping tool, you know, are intended to be a part of and included in the final digital equity plan, and some version of that will be more than likely posted on the Broadband for All portal in the digital equity session. On the you know, on the results of the survey, absolutely, I think I'll defer to Sunny to talk about the CETF, well, the phone survey, but we will make that available, as will we, you know, the information, the granular information on the online survey.
Wonderful, thank you.
Sorry, Sunny, you're muted.
How did I do that? Okay, I think, okay, thank you. I actually raised my hand because I wanted to acknowledge all the work that Eric Sasaki and Selwyn Holland and the department, all the departments in Los Angeles County, which is, you know, a quarter of the population in California. So Eric, we will have the data that actually not only breaks out by county, but it'll break out even more by census or zip code, excuse me. So that we will want to actually be able to provide back to all of you. And you can then also help in return, because that's the real value of the online survey. And you've got immense distribution networks to augment what will be, you know, in a scientific sampling, you're going to get a quarter of the folks from Los Angeles. We actually we're going to oversample elsewhere, by the way, because we'll have already a scientific sample from Los Angeles County. But I just want to take this opportunity to say, you've done so much work already. and all of the experience you have working with the departments within Los Angeles County that stepped up, helped you on December 10th. Those are distribution networks we absolutely want to call upon, your help to do. So I'm glad you spoke up so that we could call you out and give you an assignment, Eric, as if you needed more.
Great, thank you both. Question on funding. So will local government entities be able to receive BEAD and Digital Equity Act funding from the state?
I can start off. So for BEAD, we are planning to begin a rulemaking for that subgrantee program later in February. So that will be the rulemaking that will determine eligible entities for the subgrantee program. So I encourage anyone interested in that program to become a party or submit public comments so that we can hear from you regarding what entities should be eligible for the program.
And then just to follow on specifically on the Digital Equity Act programs, we will have capacity grants that follow, which is for the implementation of what we actually develop in the Digital Equity Plan. But then we will also there will also be competitive grants that are going to be open to everyone. So it is a sequential process. We have the Digital Equity Planning Grant, we have the capacity grants, and then the competitive grants.
Yeah, and Laura, I'm wondering if one of our partners from NTIA could weigh in on the distinction between the digital equity capacity grants and the competitive grants.
Gladys, are you able to unmute?
Hi. Yes. I'm sorry, Laurie, could you repeat the question? I think I heard it, but I just want to make sure.
Yeah, we just were the question is specific to local governments. Will local government entities be able to receive BEAD and Digital Equity Act funding from the state? And Rob did respond to BEAD. So if you could just address on the Digital Equity Act. So we've got capacity grants and competitive grants, and the question is specific to local governments being able to apply.
Yes, generally they should be able to. The capacity grants will be administered by CDT, and then the competitive grants by NTIA. So that really is the distinction. And the NOFO for the latter will be coming out, mid next year.
Thank you. So just a note to everyone, we're sharing what we know now. There are unknowns there because it is sequential. Once the plans are completed and submitted at the end of this year, then there is a statutory requirement that the NOFO be notice of funding opportunity be released for the capacity grants within, I believe it is 60 days from then. So we'll know a lot more as we get closer to the end of the year. And again, these meetings and the outcome area working groups are where we'll be talking a lot about what that looks like. How will the public surveys and other outreach with the working groups fit? Oh, sorry, we already covered that one. It's duplicated a few times. Will the data from the surveys and the DEEM tool be available publicly?
We will be working to develop data visualization tools that will be posted on the Broadband for All portal to reflect some of the data collection through these surveys and the DEEM tool.
Thank you, Rich. How do you plan to reach rural communities without adequate phone and internet data services?
Well, I can try to answer that. So first of all, the phone survey is a phone survey, so it's not requiring internet access. And yes, we know that nothing is perfect, but that's also why, in addition to online, which does require to have some access, we will have available for the meetings, the local and the regional local meetings, as we're calling them, a paper version. I mean, we want to invite. I know that I know what I've just said is a little challenging, but if there's people that want to be involved, we're absolutely going to try to encourage them. And it is a very important population in California for us to get input from, and we'll see what we can do to get all of that input.
Yeah, and I would just add that you know, the intention of the local and regional events also is to get out into communities. So we'd like to work with you to the extent that, you know, we can direct both entities and individuals to participate in those local outreach events. That's where, you know, we hope to gather some of those, you know, in-person, paper, online forms and input from folks.
And also, just a reminder to everyone attending or anyone that you talk to about this, we're also looking for feedback. How can we make it better? If we're not addressing something and you have suggestions on how that could be addressed, please let us know. That's feedback that we're looking for. Again, as Scott said, and has been said several times here, this is not intended to be prescriptive. We're asking for input, and we're asking for assistance throughout this process that we're leading. So this is really one of the first forums that we're going to have. There will be many others, but please continue. I think if we can have somebody just put our digital equity email in the chat, that if you think of something, please email our team, and that way we can assess it, respond to it. So really appreciate that. Okay, so I think we covered that. We're going to move on to both the outcome area working groups and questions for about the statewide planning group. So we did have questions about how can we become more involved in the outcome area working groups. And again, when we have those dates locked in and available, please continue to check the website. We posted that on there. Once we have the dates for the outcome area working groups, it will be very similar to this. We will be posting the links to it. There will be a registration, and then it will be open to the public. So right now we don't have those dates quite yet. We're working on them, and we should have them up shortly on the portal, but that's where you're going to want to check back. So there's nothing formal that you need to do. Just attend, and we'll have conversation and participation very specific to those outcome areas. So be thinking about what outcome areas you might want to be participating in. We're planning on staggering them. So if you want to participate in all of them, you can do that.
Yeah, Laura, just wanted to reinforce, I saw that we put the digital equity email in there. Yeah, it's an open door policy for the outcome area working groups. And for folks particularly interested in you know, communicating, you know, in helping, you know, shape and inform the content and agenda of those meetings and providing subject matter expertise, we would really encourage that by hearing from you on the digital equity email as well. So I think it's open door policy, and feel free to reach out to us if you really have something substantial that can't wait or can inform the process. We welcome your feedback and input.
So one of the other questions is, shouldn't digital literacy training be included in the digital literacy and inclusion outcome area working group? And the answer is yes, of course. And the other part of the answer is that these are the types of things to bring to the table when you come to the outcome area working groups, because when we say working group, it's a group where we're going to have contribution and we're going to have conversation, and it's going to be like, okay, well, what about this? Oh yeah, we need to include this. So it's definitely a consideration and a part of that group. So yes, that is going to be a big piece of it, but we're going to be working through what the recommendations are based on our stakeholder databases, the inventory of programs and assets across the state, and then taking a look at the information that we get back from all of that and the surveys, and then looking at where the gaps are and where the digital literacy training is needed, and where we can build that into the plan. So great question.
Yeah, Laura, I'm sorry. I just wanted to add to that too, because I love how you underscored working group, is that, the working group meetings are the opportunity for all of us to come together, in a public forum and to be transparent. And in between the working group meetings, the working group is going to be doing work that will be supported by the graduate student assistants that we introduced earlier. One graduate student assistant is assigned to each working group to work with the working group co-chairs and help pull together information. Also, our staff is supporting that work, and members of the Broadband Equity Partnership team is doing that as well. So really appreciate the inclusive nature of you underscoring the inclusive nature of the working groups, but also I want to underscore that that in between these meetings, there's going to be work conducted. And so again, going back to the previous question, if folks have valuable information, inputs, studies that you would like to share with those groups, please do. And I'm sorry, I'm going to extend this a little bit longer, but I think it's easier to provide examples. Camille Crittenden is here, and she is the UC representative on the education working group. They conducted and compiled an excellent report on how the UC could leverage their human and other resources to support closing the digital divide. Like, that is something that is really critical to the education outcome area working group to look through. Relatedly, the Department of Aging has done an excellent piece of work identifying, assessing the needs of seniors. And on the health front, the Department of Public Health did an excellent study, I believe in the last year or so, about how the digital divide impacts or is a social determinant of health outcomes for women and children. And so I think those are all inputs that we would like to feed into the working group and the team that's working to both compile the asset inventory and data to inform decisions and recommendations that would come out of the working group.
Thank you for that, Scott. Thank you for the extended answer. I think it helped all of us. I hope I'm not mispronouncing the name, but Ahalia Valdez, you have a question. How should a nonprofit apply to participate to support local efforts? And then you gave the example of San Diego Futures Foundation supporting digital literacy training and providing low-cost technology. If you don't mind unmuting yourself or raising your hand so we can like to hear a little bit more about how you're framing the question, if it's around specifically funding, or if it's around participating in the outcome area groups. Oh, there we go. Cole, can you unmute for me? Please.
Yeah, I believe I've unmuted. Oh, are we unmuting Mrs. Valdez?
Yes, correct.
Okay, there we go.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Actually, my colleague Whitney asked that question on my behalf, so I might have to have her tap in. Whitney.
And Teresa Valenzuela from San Diego Futures Foundation is also on the call. So
and
Teresa,
I believe I've been able to unmute the other name. With
Hello,
the same
can you
name.
hear me?
Yep. Yes.
Yes, we can.
Hi, yeah, I was just asking that because, we do provide services such as digital literacy to seniors. We are branching out into, helping ESL learners understand basic technology terms, as well as try and provide some also youth opportunities. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, how would we sort of participate in working groups, and how could our services, how could we participate in, providing these surveys, and also how we can kind of get be hands-on, involved with, using our services within San Diego. if we could be, this also might be better for, like the smaller group questions. So sorry.
No, it's a great question, I think, for us to address for everyone. And thank you for framing it so nicely. So specifically with getting involved, I think we've talked a little bit about it. Again, you'd have to stalk the events page. Based on the way what you're describing, definitely want some participation in the digital literacy and inclusion outcome area working group. And part of that is not only bringing your input and expertise to the table, but also taking a look at the programs that you are offering and services that you're helping provide as practitioners, and adding that to our list of not only stakeholders, but also the programs that we're going to make available to everybody as part of this process. So, Scott, I don't know if you want to add some additional feedback to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the question's really excellent because it provides, I think, an example of hopefully helping partner entities understand it's really at multiple levels that, as Laura indicated, that you could participate. I think, or that we welcome and encourage the participation and partnership. And part of it is like, so the digital equity ecosystem mapping tool that's exactly the kind of thing that we would want, the San Diego Futures Foundation to fill out, so that we can capture those programs that that you're doing, so they could, fit into this statewide and regional and local inventory of assets and programs. So that's one piece. Laura's spot on. I think welcome you to the outcome area working groups that are relevant to your organization, both as a partner and a participant, but as a subject matter expert. And then lastly, would say that on in terms of the local events, we would love to have you participate in the local events, and really, as we work with the Public Utilities Commission and California Emerging Technology Fund to work out what the framework and agenda is, could really, as Laura said, push you all forward as an example of a local entity that is doing work in this space. So multiple levels of participation are widely encouraged and appreciated.
Thank you for your comprehensive answer. So just to sort of make sure I understand, basically, we just need to make sure that we fill out the forms that were linked in the chat, so that we can make sure that our interest is noticed, so that on your end, after we've complete these forms, basically. And then we'll be invited to the working groups, and we could also pay attention to the events page as well to maybe participate in other events.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we'll be more proactive. The events page is going to be a place that we encourage folks to check on the updates, but we will be very proactive in our communications via email about on a regular cadence. We're sending out monthly email updates on Broadband for All, and we'll make sure that there's multiple touch points so that we know that all of the folks here are incredibly busy. So we're going to have to, repeat the opportunities and places that you can, be made aware of the occurrence of these meetings.
Thank you so much for Sunny, you have your hand up.
Well, I wanted to comment on, the question that San Diego Futures Foundation just raised as an example of a long-time community-based organization that has pretty immense capacity and reach. some of the newer people may not remember that CTF was a grantor, a partner for a number of years. Teresa was even at the groundbreaking for SR 67, so very involved and plugged into what Sandag's doing in the Digital Equity Task Force. But with respect to digital equity, I really encourage and invite the San Diego Futures Foundation and all of your other partners, there are a lot of CBOs in San Diego County, including 211, to think about how much you not only report what you can do in the DEEM tool, not only participate in the outcome working group around probably digital literacy and inclusion, but it's not limited, as you heard Laura and Scott say, to just that work group. And then really think about how much more you could accomplish if you had certain resources. We're really trying to, I think, understand how far we can push the envelope to fill in the gap. And I just want to take the opportunity to acknowledge what San Diego Futures Foundation has done over the years, and also to invite your thinking really, sort of aggressively about what more can be done.
Great. Thank you so much, Sunny. Okay, we're getting close to the end of our time here together today. And Rob, I do have a couple questions for you before we wrap up. And these are specifically on mapping. So wanted to make sure that we did get to those before we wrap. So my first question is, let's see. Will additional feedback options be available other than the map, and will the data be made available that was done for the FCC map? For example, I know of 300 locations missing from the map in my county.
Yeah, so I want to distinguish between the map that is going to be used for the BEAD allocation versus the map that will be used for the BEAD subgrantee program. And just to take a step back, the FCC published a while back some fabric locations, which is basically all the locations in the state. They had a challenge process for that. The PUC submitted a challenge of about 44,000 locations for California. About 16,000 of those were accepted by the FCC. So an additional 16,000 locations were added. We still have an issue, I believe, with how the FCC is counting multiple dwelling units, MDUs, as well as anchor institutions. So again, this will affect the BEAD allocation, so the dollars that will be allocated to California. Subsequent to the fabric challenge, the PUC filed a availability challenge on January 13th. We did not have much time to do this, by the way, and it was very, we really just had to do triage given the time we had and the amount of amount of data we had and the amount of providers. So we submitted an availability challenge. Again, we still have significant issues with the FCC's map, and we're not sure how that will be resolved. But by mid-May, there will be a map that I'll call the post-challenge map, that will be published, that will be using an updated fabric. That will be the basis for the BEAD allocation. Following that, we will be publishing internally for California a BEAD map for program eligibility. And that will include what I call California post-validated data. So based on feedback we hear from the public, as well as data that we have used to validate the, outside of the FCC's basis for the BEAD allocation. So bottom line is the BEAD map will be different for California than it will be for the BEAD allocation in May. So on the public feedback side, we do have a public feedback tool currently in the California interactive broadband map, and we intend to have that also be used for the BEAD layer, which we'll be adding on for the BEAD program. So I'm sorry that that's a really long answer, but it's sort of a complicated topic.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Rob. And one more for you, and then I'll turn it over to Chief Deputy Director Johnson. One of the problems we face in Mendocino County is the scope of need in broadband. Our county estimates that implementing last mile for the CPC priority areas will cost approximately $104 million, while our county is allocated only $57 million in FFA funds. and that bringing broadband to all underserved residents will cost over $200 million. What can a poor county do to make broadband available for all?
So and that's a very good point. And as I've said before, that the California investment model that we developed estimates the total need for the state of over $6 billion to connect all last mile locations. The priority areas are predefined eligible areas where the entities can apply for funds, but all the unserved locations that are on the priority areas map, so whether or not they fall into a priority area, are deemed presumed eligible for the federal funding account. And just to clarify, federal funding account is different from BEAD. BEAD will have a different set of criteria based on the federal rules. But for the federal funding account, these priority areas are essentially a $2 billion lens to look at a $6 billion problem. So yes, indeed, Mendocino County will have more unserved locations than there are priority areas. Applicants will have the ability to add or subtract to the priority areas. But with regard to the funding allocation, that's why we need more money, and that's why we're really working hard to get as much BEAD funding as we can get for the state to supplement the federal funding account, because $2 billion is not enough to close the digital divide.
Thank you, Rob. And that's going to conclude our Q&A portion. I want to thank everyone for contributing their questions. Great questions, great conversation. This is the first of many of those conversations. So please keep the communication and feedback coming through the form on the portal, through our email address that we posted there. And I am going to turn it back over to Chief Deputy Director Johnson. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you to the planning group members, presenters, and members of the public for attending the first statewide Digital Equity Planning Group meeting. I hope the information and updates we shared today were helpful and informative. The next statewide Digital Equity Planning Group meeting will take place on April 26, 2023 at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. As seen in the chat and mentioned during Q&A, we have provided links to many resources. I urge you to get involved and stay informed of the process by visiting the Broadband for All portal at broadbandforall.cdt.ca.gov or email us at digitalequity@state.ca.gov for more information. Finally, I'd just like to say thank you to the members of the public, regional and local leaders, and program managers for your continued interest, engagement, and participation in the state's digital equity planning efforts. The success of our program and the many related efforts depends on your involvement, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.